Welcome to our Wines of South Africa online tutorial about the potential of old wines. You can expect compact information and background knowledge presented by André Morgenthal, manager of the Old Vine Project, Jo Wessels, a world-class sommelier, and Petra Mayer, Wines of South Africa, Market Manager, Germany.
Thank you again, Petra, and for Wines of South Africa to give us this platform and the opportunity. We decided in terms of the format today that the three of us are going to talk. I'll lead the discussion with the presentation, and then Petra and Jo has got the difficult but important questions on their notes to challenge the project and also going forward in terms of our future. So everybody always asks, why South Africa and old vines, where there's been old vines across the world. I mean, if you look at California or Barossa, and I mean, Spain and Portugal, everything's old. And I mean, the vineyards are 100, 150 years old. And South Africa has only got, I think, 10 blocks that's roughly 100 years old. But the thing is that everybody's used old vines on their labels, and they would use Le Vin in France or Alten Reben in Germany, but it hasn't been actually, there hasn't been a standard. So we took the lead and we decided on 35 years and older, because if it says old vines on the label, what does it mean? And we're going to dig deeper into that during the presentation. But in South Africa, we decided 35 years. I'll get to WoSA and how she was looking for vineyards for almost 20 years, but also talking to our counterparts internationally, that Australia agrees with us that 35 is the sort of the old benchmark. It's almost like when you've been a student in your 20s and you didn't really think about you're going to grow old and turn 30. And once you turn 30, 35-ish, then you, in theory, not all of us got that right. You've got a job and a family, maybe, and a dog, and less partying over the weekends and a bit more quiet. So a vineyard's very similar, between 30 and 40 years. And this is something that I confirmed with most of the regions that I showed earlier. The vineyards come into balance, and we will talk about that close to the tasting time. So looking at the timeline. So as I said, almost 20 years ago, WoSA started looking for these old blocks, and she had an interest with why old vine wines are different. And when she was with Lomager and she and Mr. Rupert started talking about old vines, they both had an interest in, and he said to her, listen, why don't you go and find us these old blocks and create an old vine series? And at the time, some of our winemakers like Ibn Sari also started looking at this concept of old vine wines. And in 2016, Mr. Rupert gave us, gave WoSA seed funding to start the Old Vine Project, which in the beginning was quite daunting. And I was at Wines of South Africa, as Petra mentioned, and WoSA and I, we worked closely together because I wanted to know what's going on in the vineyards, to talk to the journalists, and she was in the vineyards all the time. And we used to bump into each other in a small little restaurant called Green Gate in Stellenbosch for lunch by accident, no, not by planning. And she would say to me that she's looking for money for this project of hers. And I said, well, no. We just sort of then spoke about the old vines. And eventually, one day she said to me, well, Andre, I got money from Mr. Rupert, and we want to start this project. And I've got to do this and this and that. And so on. I said, but you're viticulturists, who's going to do all this? And she sat back and she looked at me and said, well, what about you? I said, well, I've got a pretty interesting, I'm happy with at WoSA, and why should I move? It sounds very exciting. And it literally took 2 days. It was a Friday, and on the Monday I resigned and started this project. And I must say the first year and a half was very dark, and there was no handbooks because nobody else has done it. And I guess I'm getting at the point where this is a unique project that nobody else has done before. And the most important stage for us in the last year, since the last Cape Wine, is the the certified Heritage Vineyard seal, which I'll expand on in a while. So the quarrel with old vines is the fact that it's not financially viable. So there's a sort of a 20-25 year cycle with vineyards where the financial viability drops as the vine gets older, and the farmer needs to decide if he's going to replace with younger vines or something else that's agricultural more viable. So the temptation is to pull out the vines, but the reality is that the vineyards are, or the wines are of such unique quality, and it's so interesting. And what we're saying is that old vines don't necessarily make better wines. I mean, it's like old people. Ian O'Dear always says, not all old people are nice, you know. So it is about making something interesting from these old vines, but it depends on where it is and how it's managed. So we're going to look at what our objectives are and why we are, you know, doing what we're doing, and this also grew organically. On the left is the Certified Heritage Vineyards plaque. So when you're a member, you can put this up at your tasting room, or some even at the vineyards on a small little wall like they do in Burgundy. And Joe, you must jump in if you want to ask a question.
May I ask, André, how difficult is it to become a member, or what must I do to become a member?
It's not difficult at all. I'm not very strong on the admin side, so I try to make it easy as possible for people to become a member. So it's a membership agreement with guidelines in terms of viticulture and winemaking, and then you pay your membership fee and you become a member, and you order your seals to put on your bottles to show that you're certified Heritage Vineyards member, and we cross-reference the particular vineyard block to the Sarvis records, and Sarvis is the industry body that gathers all statistics in the industry, and it actually that made it possible for us to launch this project and make it possible, and it also makes us unique because no other country in the world has got planting records that dates back right to the 1900s.
André, if I may pop in and perhaps ask you to also add a little bit on the structure of the South African wine industry, because I think a lot of this has got to do with old vineyards that are owned by growers or larger cooperatives, which do not necessarily, they are not necessarily in the hands of the winemakers in the end. So perhaps you could just also elaborate a bit about the structure.
That's a very good point. So we have family-owned vineyards, estates. We have primary grape growers like Basie van Lille here on the picture with his dogs in the Skurfberg, that produces, grows grapes and delivers to a local cooperative or a wine growing producer. And then what, as I explained earlier, the quarrel here is to keep the farmers in business. Guys like Basie here that sells grapes to Eben Sadi and Chris Arlight, and the Skurfberg area also to the Malinus and other brands. And the cooperative is a big entity, and 85% of our old vines is actually tied up in this system, which made it was quite a challenge for us from the beginning to convince these cooperatives to be part of the project, because we wanted them to keep the vines in the ground. Eventually, we've got 5 big cooperatives now as members, and we managed to convince them to be part of it, and also they make their own wines, and they unlock some of these old blocks to our members, which is a very exciting part of the process for us. So I don't know if I answered your question, Joe, in terms of the system there, but that's the important part for the Old Vine project, is to involve the cooperatives. To give you an idea, this grower would, for example, deliver his grapes to the local cooperative for 2,500 Rand a ton. With the Old Vine project's advent, And up to now, he can now get 8, 15, 20,000 rand a ton, which makes it worth his while to keep the old vines in the ground, and great wines are made. And we're going to talk about premiumization and price points later through research. The vineyards in the ground is, of course, it's part of our heritage, and it's part of what we are learning about how we're going to go forward. On the photograph here is Rissa Kruger that I mentioned before. That was at the forefront of this from the beginning, and as I said, for almost 20 years. To her right is Jacques de Boer. He's a primary grower in Stellenbosch that belongs to a cooperative, but they've basically now they're selling a lot of their grapes to very, very high or premium brands, mostly Chenin and Blanc. So, and a great supporter of the project. And then, of course, the international relationships with growers, brand owners. In the middle of the Johan Kruger that developed, that joined Naked Wines a few years ago. And the process there was to protect or to save winemakers. And he went to them and said, look, it's almost a sort of a crowdfunding concept, and said, why don't we save growers and save vineyards? And they said yes. And we got hold of 1.5 hectares, I think, of Chenin Blanc in Wellington for him, and he was very successful. I think he's managing more than 40 hectares of old vines now through that project. And of course, the relationship between the grower and the brand owner. So developing a model where on my left hand on the bench is Ian O'Dear that also changed his entire model from just making wine, but now looking at old blocks and creating a series by himself. But the issue here and the challenge here is to have a responsibility with the grower and the winemaker. So everybody wins and everybody makes a sustainable living from the Old Vine project.
How does it work if there is a field, a block with old vineyards, grapes? Do you have a WhatsApp group and first come, first serve, or how do you start trading the old vine grapes?
That's a very interesting question. We've been toying with this for a few years now. It's been difficult because of the pool that might be available, but we've launched an active trading platform on our website. So our members can tell us what they need, and growers can contact us and say, I've got this and this available, and we put the two together to then trade.
Okay.
Yeah. So,
but are the winemakers then on the platform involved for a longer period with the vineyards, or do they just buy the fruit? Because I think a lot of decisions need to be made already in the vineyard in terms of quality.
Yeah, you see, the actual contract between the grower and the brand owner is something we're not involved with. So it could be a year, or it could be 3 or 5 year contract or arrangement. I know that quite a bit of these arrangements are done by a handshake, and it is quite a risky business to trade grapes, especially of this caliber. If you can imagine, it's quite costly to revive an old vine, to maintain it, and it actually in the end it's more cost effective to manage an old vineyard with less input needed because it looks after itself. But the arrangement is then between the grower and the brand owner. So in terms of hectarage, in 2016, we started with just under 3,000 hectares of 35 years and older vineyards. We've got a total planting of 90,000 in South Africa, which is dropping every year. And as you can see, it grew a little bit. And then the last statistics that we received from Savas shows a bit of a drop. And we were quite perplexed because we were excited to see the growing, to see the statistics reflecting that people are actually keeping old vines in the ground and stop pulling them out. But it was quite interesting in our second webinar, Rudiger Gretschel from VINEYARDS mentioned that that drop is due to the fact that about 30 years ago, the plantings were heavily virus infected, and those vineyards had to go. So as I said earlier, not all old vines make great wine. So for me, there's 3 sections of this 3,000 odd hectares. The first section is what's looked after and spoken for. So there are brand owners looking after those blocks already. We don't have to worry about them being pulled out. The middle part is what Rico at Vinpro always says to me, it's like saving the rhinos. You know, I don't have enough time to get there soon enough. And when we do talks like this, people tune in or they attend a talk and they come to me and say they're so disappointed. They just pulled out so many hectares of 45-year-old Chenin last month. They didn't know about the project. So that is what we're losing in the middle there. There's the good stuff. And then the last third of our old vines is the stuff that really needs to go. It's virus infected. It's really beyond repair. And unfortunately, has to go and make place for, as I'm going to explain later, to plant to grow old for the new vineyards.
Do you think there are more old vineyards to discover, André?
Yeah, we discovered all the time, and Rissa has beautiful stories of how she actually would walk in a vineyard doing normal daily work, looking as a viticulturist. And then the workers will say, but they heard that she's involved with this old vine thing, and there's a block over there that's overgrown and neglected. But every summer, you know, or spring, they can see the leaves and they know it's a red block or a white block because they go and pick the grapes and they eat it. And that's how we discovered, or Riss discovered, some of the most special blocks. We were in a block last week, a Cinsault block. And one of our questions that we received before this webinar was, how can you actually look after an old vineyard? What must you do? And this old Cinsault block that is now, that grapes go to the Mannheim for their red blend, and they also make a single bottle in Wellington Cinsault. It carried about 500 kilograms a hectare. And it's a small block, I think it's 2 hectares. It's now carrying almost 5 tons a hectare. So you can revive an old block by being very careful in terms of viticulture, mulching, and multi-nutrient, so it's macro and micro feeding that you have to give the vineyard it's almost like looking after old people. You know, it's not like, you can compare it like you're not looking after kids in high school or you know, it's an old age home, and you have to be very careful and gentle. It's not students that live on high octane coffee and what is this thing that gives you wings, the Red Bull. It's more Earl Grey tea, and in our case rooibos tea, you know, and that kind of thing, to be careful with the old vines. So that's about the old vine.
André, that's a question that I wanted to ask. We've seen some beautiful pictures over the past few slides about bush vines, these lovely fingers out of the earth. The question is, are all old vines bush vines, or are they trellised vines as well? And what is perhaps better, or does it make a difference?
I can talk about South Africa. A lot of the old vines I've seen overseas are bush vines. But in South Africa, I would say 80% would be bush vines. A lot of them have been trellised and on a single line. But over the years, that's fallen apart, and by nature, the vine grows sideways and becomes sort of a semi-trellised bush vine. I think that old vines do better as bush vines, but there's no rule of thumb. So it's mostly bush vines, yeah. But I've seen great vineyards that's trellised, that's old Chenin. This is just to give you an idea of the spread of old vines across South Africa. People often think that Swartland and West Coast, because of the hype around the region, it's got the most, and it's partly true, but in Stellenbosch, Paarl, and Wellington is where we see the most old vines. And it's spread up the West Coast due to trading, which we learned from the farmers, that the traders went to buy dried fish. And I heard this from Jan Boeland Coetzee one day, who is from the West Coast, that the traders came from the harbour in Cape Town up to Veldrift and to buy dried harders and snook to take it back to Cape Town. But on their way, they would take stuff along for the grape growers, and grape cuttings was part of it. And that's how these vineyards in Skurfberg and Te Voetpad and so on originated. So that's on the left, you see Lambert's Bay and Clanwilliam. So at Clanwilliam, you turn left, and it's about halfway towards Lambert's Bay on a small plateau. And there's only 3 farms there with grapes that WoSA discovered. And there's some beautiful stories about those farmers. The photograph of Basie van Lille with his dogs earlier is in the Skurfberg. And I think that if you talk to WoSA about it, that's basically where the whole thing started first. So she got there, a viticultural consultant called Johan Viljoen, was at Winpret at that point, I think, told her about these vineyards, and it used to go to cooperative, all the vineyards. And she found that to start the Old Vine series at Antonio Rupert Wines. And there were so many blocks that she started calling Eben and Chris Arlight and the Molyneux, and so the word spread. Those vineyards are all spoken for, and it makes fantastic wine.
I have a question here, André. Sorry, Joe. Now it's you. Now it's you.
I'm going to have some Old Vine Chenin just for the moment.
Go for it. When I look at the map, there's something interesting that comes up. If we talk about old vines, we often think perhaps of historical regions, and a place such as Constantia, which is known for things like the Vin de Constance and Muscat de Frontignan. I'm quite surprised to not see any old vines on this list from Constantia. Is there a reason for that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because that's where the first vineyards were planted, and then one would think that there would be old vines there. And then we had a question via email about marginalized or hot areas. What's the best for old vines? So WoSA and I had a chat earlier about that, and it seems like old vines or the vineyards survive better in drier conditions, which is contrary to what Petra explained earlier about Rieslings in Germany, which is basically a wet environment. If you look at Greece and Santorini. So, and interesting enough, if you look at the map as well, the concentration of old vines is not so much to the east, and that we can touch on climate change later, but we're seeing trends, rainfall and so forth, changing from the left to the right of the map. So from west to east in terms of viticulture. That's a whole different discussion, but it's also very, very part of our research we're doing. So in a wet environment, the vines are prone to Utapa, which is a wood-borne disease. So the vineyards start dying from the inside out, and they just don't last. So it seems to us that we found the most successful old vines in drier, warmer regions. But we don't like to generalize like that, but it's a... Petra?
Yeah, I have a question here where people are asking, are there, are some regions more open to the concept? I think you've answered that, but is also the old vine concept more appealing to certain generations of winemakers?
Well, that is also interesting, because long before anybody spoke about old vines, I mean, WoSA and Ken Forrester went to Boekenhoutskloof 20 years ago already for Grenache. Charles Back as well, later Bruce Jack, Jan Boeland Coetzee, Neil Ellis. Long before we understood old vines and knew about it. And Mark Kent made the Boekenhoutskloof Semillon from those 100-year-old Semillons in Franschhoek and he didn't even put old vines on the label. So I don't think it's a generational thing. I think it's more, it happened the last 10 years. When I was still with Wines of South Africa, the trend was obvious and people were interested in the old vine concept, never mind if it was Jan Boland or his son-in-law Adi or Eben Saadi in the Swartland that pioneered old vines there. It's about the old vine concept. First varieties that arrived were 4 of them with Chenin Blanc, of course. And you asked me earlier why Stellenbosch so many plantings. I mean, it's just obvious that Stellenbosch and Chenin Blanc is synonymous in a certain extent. And then the smaller plantings that's so interesting now in the portfolio is Cinsault, Palomino, and Semillon. And Colobar now, I've tasted a few very interesting Colobars recently. So we'll have to look out for that, and Claret Blanche as well. So that brings me to probably the most important part of the narrative is the certification seal, which I mentioned earlier. And it basically reflects product integrity and quality. And of course, the traceability that I mentioned through Sarvis. I think it guarantees the consumer that those 5 items. Jo, you said earlier that you would like to mention the value of the seal within your environment.
Well, in terms of my environment, and I think also for the consumer in general, it's always interesting with my studies at Geisenheim of International Wine Business. There was a lot of focus on branding and differentiation and what producers can do to really make a product stand out. They always look for a little help in terms of a back label, or whether it be also from an additional stamp or seal, whether it be a rating, or in this case, I think this certified Heritage Vineyards emblem is something that will wake a bit of interest. I think if I were a consumer that doesn't know about it, and I were to look at a bottle and see this and see the planter date of 1974, I would think, what is this? How does this affect the vine or the wine? And is this the vintage? Or I think it'd be something that could create some interest and curiosity, and really make also this category of South African wine stand out on shelves for consumers. In terms of me in the restaurant, it's always good to have this certification and to know that it is true. I've also had experiences talking with winemakers, and not in South Africa but elsewhere as well, where you speak about vines and they say yes, the vines are old, and you ask them how old are these vines, or when you consider vines to be old, then you often get the question answer of about 20 years, or until I see they do something different. But there's no real certification or something that really states that something is made from old vine material. So for me, this is also a sense of security. If I were to buy a bottle with this certification, that I know it has an origin, it is being looked after, and basically that the value that I'm paying for it as a wine buyer is going back to the producer and back to good grape material. And yes, it's an interesting story to also share to my guests. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks, Jo. So there's 3 research projects that's been going on for the last few years that I'd like to share with you, that WoSA always says, we always thought we are pretty, but now we know we are, because it's scientifically proven that old vines are different. And the first was old Vine Pinotage research at Kanonkop, where Professor Berger took genetic material from the old block that's 53 years old, and also from the young interplanted vines that were 7 years old, to see if that is genetically different. It indeed showed that there's a difference, that genetics are different in old vines. What it means for us, we don't know yet, but it is definitely a fact that the genetics change over time, and the research is ongoing with this. At University of Stellenbosch as well, there was a task team put together, a tasting panel, to see if the aroma profile of old vine Chenins are different from young vines, and they indeed found that. And as you can see, it also included mouthfeel differences, and the aroma wheel was actually adapted and these flavor indicators were added to the existing aroma wheel. I see Ina Smith, who drives the Chenin Blanc Association in South Africa, is also online, so welcome to her, and well done with all the great work for Chenin Blanc and Old Vines. The last and also ongoing project driven by the UCT Business School by Jonathan Stein is to see what is the value importance and of an old vine indicator on a wine bottle. So the first phase is completed, and it actually showed that, and I know this is a very complex slide, and I mentioned earlier that my background is not exactly what we're looking at. There are much more clever people in the audience that will be able to analyze this, but the result of this research is that for every year that a vine is older, that bottle of wine will translate into a more expensive wine. It was also found that the consumer is willing to pay an average of 300 Rand per bottle for this is African wines. We want to raise quality, raise image, raise prices for the grape grower and for the brand owner.
Is the certification seal recognized by the law, or is it just something which is taken care of by the Old Vine Project?
The agreement between the Old Vine Project and SARVIS, which is the industry body governed by the Wine and Spirits Board and the Department of Agriculture, so it's an industry-driven initiative. So it's not by law, but you can't put that planting date on that seal if we haven't cross-referenced to the planting record. So in a way, it is regulated, yes. About a year ago, we had a visit from a French nursery called Untitled. They realized that the Chenin Blanc that arrived on our shores a few centuries ago is genetically different from what the Chenin Blanc was that was sent away out of France. And they came to sample DNA from the 10 oldest blocks, Chenin Blanc blocks here in South Africa. We spent a week together. The material went back to France, where they cleaned it up from virus. But we also discovered that we have some virus-free Chenin Blanc in Skurfberg, which is very interesting and a great discovery for us, because virus is such a bad thing and dangerous for our viticulture. So this is an exciting project that's run along with Vititech in Paarl, which is our local nursery in terms of research and promulgating for our vines. And the nice thing is that the relationship between Old Vine Project, Vititech, and Ontav is that that material is going to become available to our growers here in South Africa once it's cleaned up and quarantined. Mm. And in terms of our vineyard workers, it's a passion for us and for WoSA especially. FELCO partnered with us from the beginning. They sponsor our training courses. So we do old vine pruning courses every winter before pruning starts. It is, of course, a very important part of viticulture and to ensure that we have great wines, because you can't make great wines if the work in the vineyard is not done professionally. So that's our contribution and upliftment and empowerment of our vineyard workers. And the objective for us is to bring people from pruners to master pruners and trainers. And that's exactly what we did with our classes. So the classes are small, but it's basically a representative or two from 5 or 8 of our members, and they take the knowledge back to their pruning teams. Mm-hmm. And what we've also done last year is we've trained some of WoSA's top pruning team members, who then trained the teams last year.
André, sorry if I may pop in with a question. This is perhaps related to the question about pruning, but it's all good and well that we know that the vineyards need to be handled a little differently, also be taken off closely, but do we see any different general viticultural practices perhaps in the vineyards? Or do these vineyards also require a bit more perhaps an organic approach, or are there winemakers or viticulturists that also work biodynamically with these vines? What is the general feel about what these vineyards need?
That's a good question, and it's a long answer. But okay, to prune old vines is like sculpting. It's not pruning. It's not uniform. As I mentioned with the old age home analogy earlier, you have to look at each vine separately. That each vine has gone through 30, 40, or 80 years of lifespan in a different way, and has endured the weather conditions in a different way. It's like Professor Deloire said, he was at University Stellenbosch back in France now, but he always said that it's not like human beings that can open an umbrella or run inside or switch on the air conditioner. You know, that vine sits there and has to get used to the environment. And that's what we're trying to figure out with research as well. Why do they survive where they did? But yes, mulching is very important. Careful pruning, not hard pruning. Where there's dead arm disease, for example, you don't cut the dead arm. There's often there's two reasons for that. There's often some nutrients in that so-called dead arm that the vine uses in tough times. And if you open up such a big wound, you expose the vine to virus and infection. So you have to be very careful with old vineyards. And as I mentioned earlier about the nutrients, and also what WoSA prescribes is kelp. It's a kelp product because it's a natural product and it contains everything that the vine needs. Reviving the vineyard, as I mentioned, that old Cinsault block is basically being very careful. It's organic approach, mulching, and the multi-nutrient supplements. And very careful pruning, very gentle pruning.
And how about cover crop?
Cover crop, yes. That goes part of that, yeah. We were in Johan Reineke's vineyard last week, where it's biodynamic, and there it's a very unique process, of course. Cattle roaming the vineyard, and there's this whole cycle of the grape skins and the cuttings going into the kraal for the cattle, and then the droppings in the vineyard, composting the vineyard. The only concern is when the cattle start snacking on the budding leaves and the grapes.
Okay.
So environmentally, as I've been alluding to, it's very important for us, considering climate change, learning from these old vines, why they've survived. And we coined the term plant to grow old. So we soon realized that from the onset, where it was vineyards 35 years and older, we need to protect our so-called heritage and our viticultural heritage. It's about people. There's a strong humanitarian element behind it. Saving the grape growers, the workers, developing a business model that will work for them, but also to plant vineyards that will grow old successfully through learning from the vineyards that has been there for so many decades.
These old vineyards have never been irrigated.
Yeah, often it's dry land. And I think the simple rule of thumb is, why start irrigating when it's 60 years old, when it's been surviving for so long without water? But some of the really struggling blocks, it doesn't do any harm to irrigate a little bit. But what I've heard from what Roos has done at Mr. Rupert's farm, Rubik's Rivier, where with careful viticulture and mulching, you can actually reduce irrigation from 4 to 6 times a season to once a season. So that's being water wise. It's about, as I said, being water wise. So you also looking at varieties that are more suitable for warmer conditions. So there is a project that's running in the last 10 years where varieties have been brought in, and I know Eben has planted quite a lot of it, Mediterranean varieties that's different from what we're used to, planting at altitude as well. So irrigation is a matter of the site, where the vineyard is and the variety. And if you plant varieties that don't need so much water, or the site is such that you don't need, then it's better.
Okay.
That was actually one of the questions that came to mind when we look at the grape varieties that were mentioned in the beginning, based mostly on Cinsault, Colombar, Chenin Blanc, and so forth. What will that look like in future? Will we have more Cabernet Sauvignon or Shiraz old vines, or will it be in the future Tempranillo, Albarino, what? Or will it stay more based on this pattern that we're seeing from Chenin, Colombar, Cinsault?
My crystal ball is a bit fuzzy on that one. But you know, with the work that Vitytech has been doing and is doing in terms of cleaning up material, better material, cleaner material being available, that could be the fact that we now don't even see Cabernet Sauvignon within our portfolio of old vines. I know there's a block that WoSA found just a couple of weeks ago, but the virus has been too bad. So we try to grow out of a period of virus infection. Pretty much how we're going to try and grow out of this COVID virus situation and to survive it and be cleaner going forward. So I'm not sure, but I suspect that we'll see, let's call it foreign varieties or non-traditional to South Africa varieties more prevalent going forward in the next 2-3 decades.
Is it possible to do field grafting with old vines?
Yeah.
In other words, bring on
field. Yeah. There's two schools of thought about interplanting. And Petra has asked me earlier what's the difference between replanting and interplanting. What WoSA did with that vineyard that she brought from the Swartland for Mr. Rupert to Lomarin, he asked her, he wanted an old block at Lomarin in Franschhoek, and there wasn't any, and he asked her to replant a block, an old Chenin block. She first said, "Oh, it's a difficult one. It's like replanting old roses, you know." And the thing is, it must be north, south, east, west, and you can't turn it. You got to replant that vine or rose as is, because it's been used to the sun coming from this side all its life. If you turn them around, they won't understand what's happened. It's like also relocating elderly people. And if you do it wrong, they don't last too long in an old age home and it's over. So she did this, and the block got replanted to Lomarin with about a 98-99% success. Mark van Buren makes the old Bostock Chenin from that block. So the economic impact and the media value is amazing. And Jo asked me earlier, why is it that it's successful? And we don't really know. And we could talk about it after the wine tasting, Jo, but the media coverage, when Platter Guide, Philip van Zyl came to me a few years ago and said, can't we add your logo next to each of your members' wines? And that had already introduced the category of old vine. So you'll walk into a wine shop or look at a wine list and you'll see white wine, red wine, whatever. We've actually, unbeknownst to us, which is something Jonathan pointed out to me, that's doing the research at UCT, that we created a separate category that's never actually been there and acknowledged. So in retail, we see that it's called old vine. And this year, we'll have 5 platforms where old vine will be a category in terms of awards. I've mentioned Platter Guide, Veritas and the Terroir Awards, and then Michelangelo, and then the Old Mutual Trophy Wine Show run by Michael Fridgen, and we'll actually have an old vine trophy for best old vine on show. It's different, it's interesting. There's some sort of mysticism around these old vines, and it's about, and especially when you visit the vineyards and you feel the energy. I remember when I worked in Burgundy at Domaine Bertagna, and I walked in those old blocks. It was just at Clos Vougeot. You feel the energy, and you feel it in these old blocks as well here in South Africa. There's a special energy that is translated to the bottle. So basically, we've created a triple bottom line, which is a very academic term. And again, going back to my background, I'm not very familiar with this. But we've looking at our social environment, our natural environment, and the economic business model to try and make it work for the grower, the brand owner, and ultimately for the Old Vine project to also survive in the long term, which is my challenge this year in terms of economics. And then consumers resonate with Old Vine because of trends in, let's say, wine tourism in the world at the moment. People want knowledge. When they go somewhere, they don't want to just have leisure travel. They want to learn something. They want to go away with something that they've learned about where they were, and there's a story. Stories sell wine. And there must also be a purpose and identity in terms of where they were. It mustn't just be a generic, it must be something very unique. It must be sustainable in terms of earth. The generation now that's looking at wine consumption is concerned about earth and our future. I'm going to quote WoSA by saying that COVID-19 is nature's way of saying that she's angry with us. Nature is upset with how we've been treating earth. And Old Vines is by nature nurtured, and health of course, and then experiences. You know, if you go on experiences and you tell stories, that's pivotal to the entire experience of the wine consumer.
Okay.
I can only agree from my side in the restaurant. It's you see these choices. I don't think it's only a wine theme. It starts with the choice of water that guests buy in a restaurant when they go out shopping to supermarkets, looking at fresh produce or fisheries. People want to know as well. They want the traceability. They want to know that what they buy is sustainable. And they are consuming in other ways. It's no longer a process of just buying something because it's good. They want to buy something because it makes them feel good as well. And yeah, the stories are very important.
These are four interesting elements that we've learned. Firstly, the vineyard's got its own agenda. They don't care about the fact that we want to make wine from the grapes. They are growing to survive. And that's part of what we're trying to learn from them. Why are they there? Why are they trying to survive so badly? And then the root system is very interesting. It's a myth that Old Vine's got very deep vineyard or root systems. The late Professor Archer always said, it's like students, they follow the path of least resistance. And that's true. What the vine's roots need to do is get to the nutrients, get to the water, for example. So it could be quite deep, up to 10, 14 meters I've seen. But I also saw a root system in Rioja last year that was easily 10 meters long, but this shallow. So it just hit a different soil type and went sideways until it found resources. They also are very prudent with their resources and the reserves. They're like, when I mentioned earlier, when you're in your 30s and 40s, you start looking at your pension fund and you don't spend so much money anymore. And this is exactly what they do. And it's a fact that an Old Vine reads the vintage. The Old Vine predicts the vintage. The idea with Old Vines is they've got more roots. So there's one root with lots of small little roots. Mm-hmm. So they actually maximize on how much they can draw from what they have, because they know they're growing old. They're suffering from dying vine syndrome. They know that they have to derive as much as possible, so they grow more small roots. So the actual cluster is bigger than a younger vine.
Okay.
The transplanting of the block from Swartland, they brought as much soil with as they could and the entire root system. And the hole that they dug for each vine was 1 square meter and 1.2 deep. Okay, and I've spoken about wisdom and experience. I've seen the movie. They know how to manage the vintage, and we've spoken about the root system. So finally, what is actually, as I hand over to Jo, why are these wines so special? And these 4 answers is what we've been hearing from winemakers across the world, sommeliers. The first answer is complexity, palate weight, texture, aromatics, the palate length that makes these wines so intriguing. So at that point, any questions, or we can move over to Jo to talk about the intrinsics of wine.
Okay, I have 3 wines here that were generously provided by the winemakers and the distributors to try. I do feel a little silly on the one hand because this isn't a tutor tasting, and I know that a lot of those watching do not have these wines also at home. So I don't want to do a full organoleptic tasting of the wines. I think we can just basically discuss what makes them special and how I basically see the value of them. The first wine that we have is from the Swartland, from David and Nadia, Saudi. I believe that David is actually online as well. I must apologize, there's a little mistake in the slide. This is the vintage 2018, not 2017, but just as good, even better perhaps. And yes, and this is actually not from, as I understand, not just from one single vineyard, that there are different parcels of vineyards that are blended together, up to 7 as far as I understand, and this should be an expression of the Swartland. But I think in this case, there's the seal, and we can see that the oldest vineyard, as I understand, was planted in 1962. That is really old. And yes, in terms of Chenin Blanc from South Africa, there's a variety of styles, and I think a lot of us think of South African and New World wines as being these fruit-forward, opulent wines. A lot of us think of the Sauvignon Blancs of New Zealand, for example, or the Chardonnays from California, or really these fruit bombs. And yes, they make a great impression, but I think a lot of us are looking for subtleness and really finesse in wines. And when I open this wine and also trying it, it's not a fruit bomb. It's really a beautiful, subtle wine. There's elegance to it. It's not this ripe or fruit that jumps out of the glass. You have to go search for it. It's a bit more of your bruised apples and dried pineapple, bruised apples, dried pineapple kind of style. There's a lovely spiciness, herbaceousness to it. There's some fennel happening there. Is some almost like a chalky minerality. It's a beautifully complex wine.
Jo, if I may.
Yes.
What we also found with when you taste old wines is that the wine often reflects the site and not necessarily the variety. With younger wines, the Chenin Blanc profile comes through, but with older wines, it actually shows the site. You can taste a wine and say Skurfberg or Swartland or Stellenbosch Chenin, for example.
I can only agree. I've also heard of colleagues that say that it's they get a lot more of secondary or tertiary characteristics, so not necessarily from the grape itself, but also more in terms of the winemaking or the site. So I can only agree with that. In terms of speaking of winemaking, I think also this is what I really enjoy about this wine. You can notice there's minimal intervention in the winemaking. There's I think that David and Nadia are doing a good job here of accompanying or they're accompanying the site and the grape and the vineyards, but not dominating the winemaking style. That really something comes forward in the wine. I tasted the wine just now again, and it's still there. It's there's a lovely liveliness to it. Once again, the chalky minerality that is coming through. It's got amazing length, complexity. This is really a beautiful wine. It's something that I would really put more into a style of a classic grape wine. and it's really substantial. It's something that I can really envision for working in terms of gastronomy. Also dishes that show some complexity in the way that they were created, also with a variety of different components. Something such as the good smoked trout, you can add some earthy components to it as well, some fruit components. This wine will really accompany everything very well. This is an example of a wine that if I had guests and they were to say they don't know what to drink and they want one bottle to accompany them throughout the evening, this would definitely be something to do that. And the story behind it, I think, is incredible, that you can actually also then communicate the story and the essence and the energy of what is happening down there. So yeah, that's the...
Jo, the interesting thing about this particular wine is that often these old blocks are, the wines from these old blocks are from single parcels. And as you mentioned, it is from 7 different parcels, this particular wine. So it's a blend of different sites that includes soil types that range from granite to clay to shale and a bit of limestone. So it's interesting wine in itself that stands apart from David and Nadia's single vineyard wines.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'll move on to the second wine.
How did you calculate the 35 years? Was it based on organoleptic impact when reaching 35 years? Or was it because you had the vineyards available to make sure you had enough vineyards to start the project with?
As I explained earlier, it was a discussion that we've had with many people across the world, and a sort of a general agreement that the vine comes into balance, physiological balance. And the bottom line is the juice that you get into the cellar. Mm-hmm. High acid, perfect pH, and low sugar for some reason. Mm-hmm. The grapes hang longer, but the sugars are lower, the alcohol's lower. And that comes back to that health benefit from the previous slide about wine tourism.
This is the Boekenhoutskloof Semillon 2017, a grape variety that is both beautiful in terms of gastronomy and one that is particularly close to me at heart. We were speaking earlier about I think there's a lot of storytelling about the history and the heritage of South Africa, and there's a lot of focus on Chenin Blanc. But what a lot of people don't know is that Semillon was at one stage the most planted grape variety in South Africa. And I think there's still some amazing material down there. And I think it's also a style of wine that can really can be an ambassador for South Africa. If you think of Semillon throughout the world, we know it more for perhaps the Bordeaux blends, the white Bordeaux blends, or perhaps from the Hunter Valley in Australia. Beautiful styles of wine, but I think South Africa can really come to the fore and also showcase this wine. The Boekenhoutskloof Semillon 2017 vintage, still a bit young. This I'm quite sad I don't have anything but old, because this wine ages amazingly. And in this case, it's a wine that you can also still smell the youth a bit, and that it needs some time. But once again, it's a bit more of a subtle wine, a little bit more of your lime zest, a lot of spice. Once again, orange peel. There's once again a big complexity. I do notice a little bit of use of oak on this wine, which I think is done quite nicely. It's not oak dominant, and it will actually help the wine to also age gracefully, and I think it will gain a lot of complexity with time as well. It's got a beautiful palate weight, textural. It's really something that will hold up very well with good food as well. Still also amazingly live and fresh, brilliant acidity. And yes, for me it's interesting because on the vine or on the bottle, nowhere does it state anything about being from old vines. Whereas the David and Nadia had this lovely little the seal, the Boekenhoutskloof doesn't. even though it's also from one of the oldest vineyard sites, if I'm not mistaken, 1902 or there around, André?
Yeah, the oldest block.
Oldest block, yeah. And
That's,
so,
that's where you and I went, was it last year or?
yes, 2 years ago, I think it was.
Yeah.
And that was an amazing experience. I think, André, you were saying earlier about just the energy that you also experienced in Burgundy in Côte d'Ivore, and that was for me also one of these experiences that you can't communicate it in words. I think even for those of us that haven't been in vineyards, if you think of just the calming effect and the energy that you have perhaps in the shadow of an old tree that has been there for centuries, and just basically feeling that presence of something that has been there for so much longer than you have been on this earth, that is something that defies words, and that just makes it so special.
Jo, I have a question. Would you suggest for these wines to decant them an hour before the time?
It always helps. A little bit of decanting and development always helps, and especially the Boekenhoutskloof, I think, could do with some air, but I think it also needs patience. Mm-hmm. If I'm lucky, I still have a bottle of 2004 or 5 back home, and I'm really looking forward to visit South Africa again and crack open that bottle. So have some patience, or open it up and enjoy it throughout the evening. For me, it's interesting also about the Semillon. I heard from André an interesting story about the vineyard, because originally I thought it was 100% Semillon, but I heard that there's also some Muscat in there, and perhaps André, you can tell the story of where the Muscat comes from and what happened to the grapes before it got added to the Semillon.
I'm getting it from both sides now, from Nadia and Petra, about timing, so I'll be quick. So the winemaker Gottfried went to look at the Semillon block on a particular farm there in Franschhoek and saw the Muscat, asked the farmer's wife about this. She said, no, I cook jam from it every year. He said, well, I like it. So he made some wine and blended it into the Semillon.
Third bottle, now we are moving to Ian O'Dear, who's also in the panel, and this is Old Vine Cinsault, vintage 2015. Cinsault, which I also appreciate because it's something uniquely South African, and the styles of wine are also something I think very special and great in terms of gastronomy. It's not one of these big, bold, heavy wines. Cinsault, I don't know if you can see the color, but it's a bit more light, a bit more translucent, really a bit more delicate. In terms of the profile, it's I know I said about the others that they are a bit more tertiary and holding back, but this one you really get a lot of crushed berries. It's a bit more of a delicate fruit, a lot of floral components. It's quite perfumed. It's just really incredible to smell, and you always keep going back. On the palate, it's a lighter wine, so it's not dominant. It's not too much. There's a little bit of grip, but not too much tannin or extract. This style of wine, I think it heads in the direction of what sommeliers always love, is good Burgundy or even some well-made Beaujolais. So the lighter styles of wine that we can pair with food, and not kill the creations that our chefs make. It's always very heartbreaking for me when guests want to order a red wine and they really insist on having those really heavy, big wines. They're beautiful, of course, but sometimes I feel they're doing the food that they order an injustice. And we need to be there on the floor and make such suggestions of wines that really fit the cuisine very well. Beautiful Cinsault. I know the time is heading on, so I think it's a theme internationally. And the quality is there, no doubt, and I think it's a category that we can really promote as well. As I said, and I think we mentioned earlier, there are other old vine associations throughout the world. There's the Old Vines Barossa chapter, there's the Vineyard movement in Chile, for example. There's also in California, I think with the Lodi, Old Vine Zinfandel movement carrying on there. So there's interest internationally in terms of this category, but in terms of what the Old Vine Project is doing, and really setting the benchmark of what old wines are and how to work with them and supporting the industry. I think that makes this category of wine really special. And yes, I look forward to seeing more of these wines in restaurants.
I still have an open question here, which I more or less would like to answer, because a part that needs to that's something, you know, that needs to be addressed directly to André. This is the question, how expensive, or producers complain it's too expensive to become old wine certified. But I think we unfortunately don't have the time now to go in a deeper discussion. But the second part of the question is, what can be done to encourage these farmers to preserve old wines? And I think what can be done from our market side is very much to promote these wines and showcase these wines. And I also address towards the retail and trade to actually emphasize that the story of old wines, because when I researched for old wines on the lists of German importers, I realized that story is not really taken to the point of sale or to the point of purchase. And I think we need to communicate the story, need to communicate the benefits. We have to make these wines visible and to make sure that consumers understand why to pay a little more for the wines. And where the Old Wine Project has done its bit is, of course, to implement a seal, which guarantees the integrity of the term and the quality inside of the bottle. And yeah, it should not only be the glory taken to the brand owner, to the winemaker who is the star. You know, we are always talking about these famous winemaker, but the money must be taken to the growers. And I love to see the people on the ground in the vineyards, and that's where the money needs to go. And that's where I get goosebumps, and I also feel the energy that we are closing the circle, and that we as consumers and marketeers actually have a responsibility or can make a difference.
Petra, if I can perhaps add on that last note of us making a difference, perhaps to the international audience listening. I don't know if they're all aware of the difficulties at the moment in South Africa with the lockdown, and there's a complete ban on alcohol sales, and it's really hitting the industry and the good people down there really hard. And if I can usher a wish from my side to my colleagues here in Germany and Europe, let's do our best to promote sales of South African wines and do what we can from here to support the industry and all the winemakers and farmers down there. They are already in a time of need, and we can support and enjoy some good wines on the way.
Thank you so much, Jo and André, for your insights and your commitment to convey this exciting topic in a very practical manner. Dear guests, thank you very much for your attention and your interest. If you have any further questions about old wines or wines from old vines, please get in touch with us. We're looking forward to hearing from you.